All right, welcome everyone to this first plenary session. We'll go ahead and get underway. We have 4 excellent presentations lined up, beginning with Dr. Kat Cottrell, presenting Understanding Musicians' Perspectives on Primary Healthcare Needs and Service Accessibility in Canada, a Mixed Methods Study.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here together with you today and to see some wonderful faces out there in the audience. So I have nothing to disclose in terms of conflict of interest, but I did receive $5,000 from McMaster's research fund for this project. So why did we do this research? Well, there's a large portion of musicians in Canada, and those who are professionals, over half are self-employed, earning significantly less than the Canadian average. As outlined in our keynote speaker this morning, there's high injury and illness rates within this population. These issues are within the scope of family medicine, which is offered to all in our universal healthcare system in Canada. But is it actually serving our population, especially given the crisis that's happening in family medicine in Canada at the moment? So we conducted a national survey and focus groups to explore the following 2 questions. What are Canadian musicians' perspectives on their unique healthcare needs? And does the current primary healthcare system in Canada meet these needs? And if not, why not? So we did an online national survey, online survey, for 2 months last year. The inclusion criteria were over 18s, musicians who've been in Canada for over a year and have had a health-related condition that interfered with their ability to perform. We advertised that there was $10 available for the first 200 respondents. We then conducted online focus groups from people that selected themselves from the survey. The questions were based on emerging themes from the survey results and took place on Zoom, and each person received $30. We analysed our data using inductive thematic analysis and mixed methods. Thank you. Our survey got 913 responses, but 256 were excluded for the following reasons. This left us with 657 valid responses. 325 of those came through while it was advertised that $10 was available, and 332 once it was made clear to respondents that all the $10 had gone. So if we quickly look at the characteristics of the survey participants, this is all 657. We can see that geographically they represented pretty well Canada. There were fewer from Quebec, likely due to the fact that this was an English survey and the predominant language in Quebec is French, and were generally 45 and under, with a few in the older age category. I'm not implying 46 to 60 is older, but you know what I mean. In terms of gender identities, we had a fairly diverse range representative of the Canadian population. And in terms of the income earned as professional musicians, quite a lot of people were earning a significant amount of their income as professionals. These are the instruments and voices of our participants, which span quite a good range. And then if we look at the focus group participants, of which there were 11, again, geographically fairly representative, again, none from Quebec, likely due to the language, and ages of participants were working age. We had many more female participants than male and no other genders represented. And in terms of instruments and voices, many more vocalists and multi-instrumentalists than our survey population. So coming back to our question, what were we asking these people? What are their perspectives on their healthcare needs? And does the current primary care system meet their needs? So just to talk through some of these graphs before we actually talk about the data. So the white lines show all participants, the green ones for those that were offered $10, and red for no $10. And then the numbers at the bottom are mean and standard deviation. So here you can see that on a scale of 1 to 5, in terms of physical health, the mean was 3.46, so okay to very good for physical health, and slightly less than that for mental health. And again, there's quite a difference in the groups, which we'll talk about at the end. In terms of the reported health conditions of our survey participants, huge amount of mental health, musculoskeletal, neurological, orthopedic, chronic disease, ENT, with smaller amounts of other categories. It's also important to note, both in the survey and the focus group, people noted that COVID-19 was magnifying existing stressors, and this was still true in 2024. So our results came out as 4 themes. The first theme was about identity and health and how they're intertwined. It was clear that injuries, chronic diseases, and temporary impairments were not only career barriers, but existential threats. They resulted in people feeling they lost their identity, causing emotional distress, fearing permanent loss both of work and their ability to perform, difficulty coping with the uncertainty of what their injury or illness might mean, and the inability to perform often resulted in depression, anxiety, and worthlessness. I lost my voice for 3 months. I felt like I lost who I was. Moving on to access and experience of care. So like I said, Canada has universal healthcare. So 92.4% of people actually did have a primary healthcare provider. And you can see from this graph that people did actually attend that primary healthcare provider pretty frequently. In terms of their experience of care, 43% of people did feel listened to with their specific music-related concerns, and again, the mean average was 3.2, so that's to some degree a bit more than that. And in terms of whether their treatment plan took into account their musician-specific challenges, it was about 3, so to some degree, again with a spread that varies between the 3 groups we had. And overall, did they feel their healthcare needs were sufficiently met? Well, if we look at everyone, 70% said yes. But if we look at the group that weren't offered the money, it was 50-50, so quite a big difference. Thinking about theme 2, so for those people that weren't satisfied with the care that they were receiving, what were their barriers to care within the healthcare setting? Due to the geographic nature of Canada, there was significant disparities across the country. People often felt a lack of provider understanding, stigma that they faced when seeking care, and often felt belittled or not believed. If we look at the middle quote here, they don't understand that playing is my job. If I say I'm in pain while playing, they just tell me to stop for a while. That's not realistic. And at the bottom, you're bounced around between specialists and nobody really sees the whole picture. It's exhausting. I wish there was someone who could just oversee my care. The third theme we're going to look at is stigma within the music community itself. People felt a strong fear of losing work or being seen unreliable if they were faced with illness or injury. There was a lot of discussion about institutional cultures that shame prioritizing health and rest with a music must go on mentality. But it's important to note that one thing that shone through was people did feel a strong support within trusted peer networks, where they received empathy, validation, and suggestions of where to turn for help. You can see at the bottom here, I was talking to other musicians who I know have similar issues, kind of behind closed doors. The fourth and final theme was about financial and structural insecurity. Many people felt that there was no safety net, so if there was illness or injury, they lost income. On top of that, to get better, the financial burden of therapies was often insurmountable. And again, talking about the geographic nature of Canada, there were many transportation barriers to accessing care as well. You can't work, you can't get paid, and there's no safety net. That stress alone makes you sick. So moving on to what would actually make a difference. So we asked our survey participants if their primary healthcare provider having knowledge of specific needs of musicians would increase their willingness to seek care. And overwhelmingly they said yes, but again, a few differences in the different groups there. We then asked a qualitative question in the survey of what would be beneficial for their primary healthcare provider to offer, and then we categorized them into these groups. So people felt adjustments to delivery would help to meet their specific needs as often traveling musicians or with different hours, specific referrals, condition-specific support, work-related resources, and finally financial assistance support. So this is a summary of the themes of recommendations both from the survey and focus group, highlighted by quotes from the focus group. So people wanted networks of practitioners that understood. They wanted help to cover some of the costs of treatment. They wanted institutions to have at least part-time health staff for someone to turn to. They wanted mandatory classes in in educational institutions. They wanted leaders to talk about mental health and the challenges in the industry so they wouldn't feel so ashamed to ask for help. They wanted a place to turn for resources such as the websites where they could find help. And finally, they wanted more peer networks to support each other through these challenges. So we're just going to take a step away from those results for a second and think about what the difference is between the $10 and no $10 group. This was not something that we thought we were asking in our initial study. We thought if we get 200 responses, that would be great. But when the results came in, more and more people were responding. It was hard to ignore the differences that came up here. So in the interest of time, I won't talk through these individually, but to summarize, the group that were not offered $10 and knew it wasn't available, more so were from Ontario. There was a wide age distribution with more in the older age category. They generally earned less of their income as professional musicians, and there was a much greater gender diversity. And this transpired into them reporting worse self-rated mental and physical health. They visited their healthcare provider less often, were less likely to feel listened to by their healthcare provider, were less likely to feel their musician needs were considered in the treatment plan, less likely to feel their health needs were met overall, and for a greater proportion, even if their healthcare provider had specific knowledge, it would not have increased their willingness to seek care. So really quite peculiar findings that we weren't expecting. So what could be the reasons for these? Well, it could be sampling bias. So those motivated to participate when there was no money available might have had a higher baseline distress and wanted a space to share that. There might be a psychological framing effect factor, so they might be primed to focus on grievances, whereas the $10 group may have approached it more neutrally. There might be a factor of trust and expectations, so those being offered payment might have felt more validated or respectful by healthcare institutions. And finally, as we just went through with the demographic differences, there might be a difference in terms of professional context and identity, with more established professionals with more complex health demands having a different experience than the younger population and different population that answered who were offered the $10. So coming back to our study as a whole, many musicians face profound mental and physical health challenges and are often doing this in isolation, unsupported by the healthcare system or their industry. Even though in Canada we're lucky enough to be technically attached to care, many musicians still feel unseen, misunderstood, or unsupported. Systemic reform is needed to manage the complex mixture of issues that musicians face, including stigma, occupational risks, and precarious working conditions. We believe that musicians are integral to Canadian public life, and they deserve a healthcare system that recognizes the realities of their work and supports them in their capacity to thrive. So our action plan from our study is to create trauma-informed and culturally competent networks of primary healthcare professionals who understand musicians' occupational demands, build policies to improve access to income protection and insurance to cover healthcare needs, bring about institutional changes to provide access to healthcare professionals and decrease stigma and shame, empower musicians with knowledge through educational establishments and access to resources, and finally, form and develop advocacy structures and peer support networks. Thank you so much for listening. I know I went through it fast. Our slides are on our website if you'd like to see them more, and this is my favorite Canadian musician. Thank you.